The following is a conversation with Harley Rustad, who is the author of Lost in the Valley of Death, which is both the subject of this podcast and as well a story about the life and disappearance of Justin Alexander, who is a wonderfully inspiring character who shocked everyone when he went missing in the Indian Himalayas at 35 years old, just a few years ago in 2016. Justin Alexander, who is the subject of Harley's book, is a true vagabond's vagabond. Born in the early 80s in Florida, raised by a single mother, by the time Justin disappeared at 35 years old, he had experienced more life than most can claim in generations. He toured internationally as a rock star, traveled the world as a high-flying corporate businessman, was an extremely accomplished outdoorsman, and as well carved himself out as one of the original travel influencers on Instagram. Justin's disappearance is shrouded in mystery, corruption, and misfortune. I find Justin an incredibly interesting figure, and hopefully this is not too cliche to say, but as well an inspiring one. I obviously never knew Justin, but having read Harley's book, I felt like I really understood him when it came to this anxiety about growing old and not having experienced every possible thing that the world makes available to us. The constant sprint away from responsibility and the romantic ideal that the answer you're looking for just lies over there, over the hill, in one more hike away from society. In the end, it looks like Justin just rolled the dice one too many times. He disappeared in 2016 under very suspicious circumstances in India's high Himalayas. Harley and I spend much of the time in this podcast speaking not only about Justin's story specifically, but as well India as a spiritual destination, since a huge part of this story is the myriad disappearances of Western tourists in India's Parvati Valley, as well as other places throughout India. There is a magical and mystical nature to India, and it attracts the most extreme types of tourism and travel, making it such a fascinating case study of fringe behavior. Harley and I together, we speak about what kind of a bloke Justin was, gurus and the spiritual nature of India, Sadhus, India syndrome, appearing on the Chris Ryan and Rolf podcast, and as well, I hope you'll agree, a general meta theme of the virtues of adventure. So thank you again, Harley, for the chat. It really was an immense pleasure to do this with you. And the book once more, Lost in the Valley of Death, the author, the voice you hear in this podcast, Harley Rustad. And here is the conversation. Harley, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us, mate.
Thanks so much for having me.
Really, it's my pleasure. To start off, I want to get a sense for the type of bloke that Justin was. And so can you talk about this real/fictional character that he looked up to as a boy, the stalking wolf, and how this might give a really good explanation as to the type of person Justin was?
Sure. So Justin was born in Florida in the early 80s and had sort of a slightly tumultuous upbringing. His parents divorced when he was quite young and was raised largely by his mom, who took him across the country to the west coast of the U.S. And quite quickly, he realized that high school was not quite his path, or was how he was really resonating and connecting with people and was feeling inspired. And so his mom withdrew him from high school and entered him into these wilderness schools, which there's this long history in the U.S. of these academies, quite formal ones on the West Coast and on the East Coast, with these legendary figures who train, young kids, but also adults in wilderness survival, tracking, nature awareness, this whole philosophy. There's a spiritual element to it, and it's really rooted in Native American traditions. And there's this one figure written about by one of these legendary teachers named Tom Brown Jr., and that figure is called Stalking Wolf. And Tom's written about him a ton in a bunch of different books, and he became this kind of mythical figure, and a lot of people aren't even certain whether or not he existed or whether or not he's a bit of a composite in Tom Brown Jr.'s mind. But he was used as this archetype for teaching young kids and adults how to be closer to the earth, how to track animals, and Justin idolized him. He was one of those first, as a young kid, you have got a lot of people you look up to, and Justin was particularly fascinated by stalking Wolf. And as somebody who had such confidence in nature, had such skills to follow a path, but also to start fires and build shelters, but more deeply had this really spiritual connection to nature and to the earth. And it was something that Justin revered and I think in a lot of ways wanted to live his life by.
Mm. Yeah, it's also really foreshadowed the trajectory of his life, especially how it sort of ended up. Like, he was a real outdoorsman, wasn't he? Extremely qualified to live in the wild.
He was, and he wasn't somebody who kind of dabbled in this world. He was somebody who really threw himself into it. And that's also kind of a theme throughout Justin's life, is he did things to their extremes. He pushed himself, but also was devoted to whatever job he had or whatever calling he felt. And when he was placed in these situations in the wild, he was absolutely comfortable. He was somebody who was known to be able to start a fire, essentially by rubbing two sticks together in faster than you could with a lighter and matches, but also was known as someone who kind of took on these quite daring feats in the wild, running for miles and miles while holding a gulp of water in your mouth without swallowing, or
really? Wow.
or teaching himself how to climb a tree and fall out of it safely. So you're grabbing branches as you fall, like it's something out of the movie Avatar. And he had these skills, and he developed them, and he practiced them, and was absolutely somebody who was not naive or not incompetent when put into solitary or challenging situations in the wild.
You know how it was later sort of revealed that maybe a lot of his online persona was rather embellished and his stories were embellished as well. Do you think also this idea of him running miles with a gulp of water in his mouth is also something that gets embellished over time? Much like stalking Wolf is himself a very embellished character, perhaps too real for reality?
It was something that I thought a lot about in researching and reporting this book, because what is presented online is never 100% truthful. I do it. I think everybody, presents a certain image of how they want to be seen, whether that's on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or what have you. And it's always curated. It's always slightly more glistening and slightly more positive. And so as a reporter, as somebody who is ultimately trying to recreate this life in a truthful and accurate way, it presented a lot of challenges, because I knew that everything Justin posted, I had to in some way question. I had to interrogate, and I had to investigate. And at times I uncovered discrepancies in the truth. And there were definitely times, and I mentioned a couple of these in the book, where Justin went on this grand adventure or trip, and what he shared online of how that trip went or what that trip ended up being was quite different than when I tracked down the person that he had gone with when he had said it had been a solo journey, or knew that he had to buy permits to enter into this one region when he said he had kind of snuck in and was presented as kind of this grand adventurous expedition. And so there were a lot of moments throughout this, and social media ended up being this incredible research tool, because there were posts and photographs and videos, timestamps, and people tagged in the photos that I could then question and interview. But it also presented this really great challenge of trying to navigate through what is truth and what is embellishment, or what is potentially outright fiction, with what he posted online. And in some ways, it made a more interesting story for me in the end.
A more real person.
A more real person, and a lot more relatable person, but also kind of raise these, I think, very current issues that a lot of people are struggling with, or at least navigating, is, where is the truth in our life? Is it this person that we present to the world in our work or in our play and in our social media, and however we present ourselves to the world? Is that a truthful representation and portrait of who we are in our hearts? And what happens when it's not? What happens when it becomes something bigger than ourselves? And for Justin, you know, the latter kind of 3 or 4 years of his life built up this really quite sizable social media following, in almost like this train that was getting away from him, and he was sort of stuck on it and not sure about where it was taking him. And so it raised all these really interesting questions that I think kind of updated this classic adventure kind of gone wrong story for a modern audience.
Mm. Did you end up getting access to his blog and things that he'd written before it expired?
Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of tools that journalists can use. There's one called the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, and you can essentially plug in any URL, and the Internet Archive takes date stamps, so essentially just like screenshots the page and archives it. And so I could go back and find every blog post that he made and when he uploaded it. It's a great tool, but there was also
I've used it before.
lot.
I didn't know that it was that effective.
It's really great. And so even if web pages have been taken down, you can still access certain information. You can even download documents and all sorts of stuff. It's a really incredible resource. But, you know, he had written for different travel blogs. He had been interviewed for travel podcasts, and had this really profound and consistent social media presence. So there was this treasure trove of information for me to follow and dig into and cross-reference and establish timelines and a huge amount of information, and also to hear his voice, you know, not only in a Q&A on the page, but also in a podcast, which was a really kind of powerful experience for somebody who is, you know, no longer with us and presumed dead, is to hear his voice and to hear him talk about certain things was quite a rare thing, and was quite a powerful thing to listen to and to go through.
Mm. So Justin has had his development years in these sort of outdoor academies, these academies of the wild. He, like you said, could create a fire with 2 sticks quicker than someone could with a lighter. He was a true outdoorsman, a real wild guy, very adventurous guy, but also an extremely competent person. He seemed to excel in absolutely everything that he did. So can you take us back to maybe, I guess, the end of his adolescence, and then the years that fill before ultimately he gets to the sort of cliche that all adventurous travel roads lead to India? Can you fill in the gaps between then and then?
Mm-hmm. So he was a bit of a chameleon. He was one of these people who constantly changed his skin to sort of almost kind of test his personality and test his interests, to see if that was something that was ultimately truly fulfilling him and a path that he really wanted to walk down. And so after spending quite a few years training at the Tracker School, which is this legendary academy in New Jersey, he does something very different. He moves across the country to San Francisco and starts working at essentially kind of a youth academy mentorship program that's attached to some secondary schools, and worked with kids, which is something that was this kind of through arc throughout his life, mentoring young kids, but also entered and fronted a punk rock band for about 6 years. And that was a complete departure from who he was, you know, on stage. You know, he had gone from this kind of, you know, isolated, solitary boy in the wilds of Washington State and New Jersey to standing on stages in San Francisco. And they did quite well. They were well known in the Bay Area. They toured Japan, and you could see this person kind of blossoming on stage in confidence, but also recognizing that this spotlight both the good and the bad that can come with that. And then was presented with this opportunity in another one of these grand transformations, quite quickly quits his job, and the band kind of falls apart, and he moves back to Miami to Florida. Back to Florida to Miami, where he becomes the traveling face of this tech startup and is very, very successful. Travels all around the world, staying in fancy hotels and eating in Michelin-starred restaurants and kind of living this high life. Has an apartment in Miami, and kind of enters into this quite lavish lifestyle that was another complete departure from who he was. And I think a lot of people who knew him were quite surprised by it. But it afforded him this opportunity to travel the world. And he had gotten a taste for it when he was in San Francisco. He had traveled to Nepal and to Thailand and had these big trips that really influenced him and his spirituality and this desire to, the itchy feet that I think a lot of people can connect with. He got that first taste when he was based out of San Francisco. And so he works in Miami at this tech startup for 3 years and builds up this nest egg that ultimately allows him to quit his job and embark on this essentially indefinite life on the road. Again, kind of this classic break free that I think a lot of people in similar situations have entered, those gates that they've approached to and stepped through, is this dissatisfaction with your path that you're on, but also having this privilege, this opportunity to see if an indefinite life on the road was something that was going to satisfy him. And so he gives away his belongings. He, gives up his apartment. He has a motorcycle and a backpack, and he begins traveling around the U.S. By motorcycle. And he does that for a few times. This is kind of where the story starts to pick up, and he travels down to South America for a few months, and then ultimately leaves everything and goes on this international trip to the Pacific Islands in the Philippines, to Thailand, back to Nepal, and then ultimately his first trip to India, which is where the book begins, is in India, and it's where the book ends, is back in India. And so he truly was one of these people who constantly was reinventing himself and constantly testing different opportunities that he was afforded to see what could be found in those opportunities, and ultimately realized that what truly satisfied him was traveling, was exploring, was meeting new people, was that kind of cultural exchange that I think a lot of people who've traveled anywhere can really appreciate. But it's also a trip that is often without end. You can be searching for a very, very long time for that kind of pinnacle, that kind of moment that puts your life into context. And India is where the story culminates.
He was 35 when he went missing, right?
Yeah.
How old was he when he set foot in India?
He was 35, so he...
Okay, so it all happened within a year.
Mm-hmm. So he left
okay.
in kind of January of 2016 on this international trip, and crossed over into India in June of that year, and arrived in that country. I've spent a couple years in India, and as a traveler and as a journalist, and you see these people landing, and they've got a couple weeks, and they want to go to the Taj Mahal, and they want to go and do a desert safari in Rajasthan and see those beautiful forts, and they want to go to stay in an ashram or kind of have that experience, go to these incredible markets, and kind of stay in this bubble. And Justin arrived not to do those classic things. He arrived with a very determined plan in his mind, and that was to buy another motorcycle, a Royal Enfield, which is this classic mountain motorcycle of the Himalayas, where pretty much everybody knows how to repair them, to buy a motorcycle and to drive to the Himalayas. And very early on, and in some ways a classic trip, but he always had his ability to push it a bit further than anybody else. And very early on had this goal in his mind. And I spoke with somebody who he met in the first couple of weeks after arriving in India, and she had taken notes in her journal about meeting Justin, and how even then he had this goal of going to the mountains, finding a cave, and testing himself in a very extreme environment, and kind of cutting himself off from technology and social media and his phone, even though it enabled him to have a break from that. And I thought that was very telling, that he was always somebody that lived with this intention and had the ability and the dedication to see it through. And ultimately he rides his motorcycle into this place called the Parvati Valley, which is this very small sliver of Himalayan India, just staggeringly beautiful, intimate, close encounters with some of the biggest mountains in the world, pilgrimage destination, temples around every corner, these holy hot springs, and just this really beautiful, beautiful place that has attracted travelers and tourists and backpackers for generations. And, had this really determined goal to go as far as he could within that valley and to find a cave to live in. And, there's a lot of people that may go to India that want to have a solitary, mountain moment, but very few who would go and spend nearly a month living in a cave in the mountains testing himself. And that's what he did.
Although the few out there among us in the global population who are inclined for that type of extreme vagabonding, it's like extreme interest in finding the spiritual self or some sort of enlightenment, all roads lead to India. That's where they'll end up, like a cliche, inadvertently going. And any of us who have spent a bit of time in Asia have come across these types. And I wanted to bring up an anecdote with you, whether it was off air or later, but about this old German hippie who I became friends with, who was looking for the rainbow people. And at the time, I thought it was just, he was just like, he explained it to me, and I thought, this is the most fringe thing ever. I've never heard of it. But then I saw in your book that this exact same festival was happening up in the Parvati Valley, and it validated it for me. It's like, hey, this guy wasn't nuts. There was genuinely some like secret community that had super strict rules about communication, so it didn't become this sort of so it didn't get access to people that weren't legit. But anyway, so
and you're right. I mean, India for centuries has been this beacon for spiritual travelers, and all the way back to the impressions that Marco Polo left of India, and it's all kind of rooted in part reality, but in part a fabrication of people's minds in the West of what India is as this kind of magical, holy destination where if you go there and find your tree or your mountain, you will achieve enlightenment. And in some ways, it's true. I mean, I had, as someone who is not religious, didn't grow up with any spiritual background, had these incredibly profound moments in that country that are hard to explain and hard to kind of get my head around. And I know I'm not the only one who felt that way about that corner of the world. And so many people, and I think that's what people hold in their minds, is they read these books, they hear these stories, they think that they can have a similar experience there. And India is I would argue unique in the world in that place that it occupies in people's minds, and has been this, like a call of sirens for people who want to explore their spiritual path, and India has innumerable paths for you to walk down, whether it leads you to a remote mountain valley, or to the feet of a guru, into an ashram, into temples of in any number of denominations and experiences. And I think that's what's so attractive to a lot of people, is that they feel like they can find their path there, and they can have their experience, whether it is a Buddha-like enlightening moment or whether it is something smaller. And for me, I went there first as a post-university graduate, didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, so I'll go to India for a year and just backpack around. And it was then when I really started writing. It was then, and it was all kind of personal stuff, but it was during that trip that I look back on as being incredibly formative and transformative for my experience, and how I eventually ended up on the path that I'm on right now. And I think that lure of India as being this place that can help you, can answer the questions that you've long held in your mind and in your heart, is a perennial one, and it's one that's not going away. It's existed for centuries, and through the hippie trail years, and all the way up to this new enormous wave of tourists that has been going to India in the past decade and a couple decades. And whether that promise is real or whether it's built up in our minds is almost irrelevant, because the lure will always be there, and that draw will always be so strong, of the promise of an experience. And I think it's brought a lot of people there, and I think ultimately it brought Justin there as well.
I'm glad that you've introduced this whole angle of India, which, like I said to you off air, for me was the most fascinating part of the book. So I'm hoping we could park Justin's story to the side for one moment, because we've very briefly, obviously people need to read the book to get the full story, but very briefly, his upbringing, his influences of the wild, influence of the wild, being an international rock star, being a bit of an international corporate guy. He's had a lot of different experiences. He left this incredible impression on almost everyone he met. He was likely the most charismatic guy in most rooms he was in for his entire life. Now he's at India. He's looking for spirituality. Though you can also say that he's also running from commitment, because he knows that there's so much more potential in him, and he wants to get as much experience as he possibly can, because maybe he sees all the people around him his own age, they're starting to settle down, like a classic classic experience so many men and women get to in their late 20s, right? And again, it's like the cliche you'll meet in Asia of that age traveling abroad. But Justin was sort of an extra level because he was so charismatic. But anyway, I think we've done justice explaining who he was to this point. So if we could park him aside and then speak more about India. Can you introduce the general geography? Introduce us to India. What is this country? The differences in the religions, differences in culture, the size of it, big population centers, the tourism, if possible.
Yeah, that's a big question, and it's a tough one to answer, because it's a place that is sort of hard to define. It's hard to make any kind of broad sweeping conclusion or comment on what India is, because it is so big. There are these kind of epic train rides that can take you 7, 8, 9 days to get across the country. So geographically, it's enormous, but it's also culturally very, very diverse. So I often kind of compared it to a bit like traveling through Western Europe. You cross over the border from Germany into France, and there's a new language, there's new food that you're being introduced to, there's new culture, new customs, all sorts of things, and crossing over just within India between states is often a bit like that experience, where the food changes, there's new dialects and new languages, and the dominant religion is very different. And yeah, I mean, yeah. And so if you go up to, down south, is just very, very, very different from the Northeast, which has a lot of kind of Southeast Asian and Tibetan influences. And the very north of India is, there's a region up there that some people have said is, kind of more like Tibet than Tibet actually is, because of the influences that Tibet has gone through, and because some of the Tibetan culture it's been easier to preserve it. Yeah, and it's been easier to preserve it in India. It is, anybody who can tell you, traveling to India is going to be like this, is just wrong, is just straight up, it's going to lead you to disappointment and to, to be frank, inaccuracy, because it is so hard to define it as something. And in some ways, that what makes it so attractive for travelers and for tourists to go there is because you don't really know what this experience is going to be like. I think people who go to France or, come to Canada or go to Australia kind of have an idea of what, even though Canada is enormous, kind of have an idea of what it's going to be like. And India can be very challenging for a lot of people. And, I've met a lot of people who've gone there who you kind of get these polar extremes. You get people who absolutely love it or who absolutely hate it. And, people who get caught up in the movement and the things that it can offer you, or the people who it just does not connect with them. And both of them are totally fine. But, it has this, as diverse as it is, it also has these enormous discrepancies in population and in socioeconomic status. So, the experience of going to Delhi, for example, or Mumbai or Kolkata is very, very different than going up into the Himalayas to these remote villages. You're talking about a city that essentially has half the population of Canada packed into, it's this one area. It is so dense of people. The whole kind of notion of personal space just is, it's tough to find in a city of millions and millions and millions. And so again, to say India is crowded or, all of these kind of stereotypes only apply to a certain part of the country. And so it has, I've always kind of thought of it that it has something for everyone. If you are into, cities and markets, and it has that in spades. If you want to go hiking, it's got the most incredible hiking in the world. If you want spirituality, it's got every possible path you could walk down, Buddhist and Jain and Hindu and Muslim and Zoroastrian and everything, Christian. And if you want crowds and if you want solitude, if you want, the best food in the world and some stuff that's going to make your stomach turn, it's got everything. It has absolutely everything. So it's a really tough question to answer because it's indefinable and it is so diverse that in some ways that makes it a challenge for some people to go and try to make sense of and try to walk through. But I think in a lot of ways, that's also what makes it so alluring is it's kind of quite unique place. I think it occupies not only in our minds, but, when we set foot there, it's compelling and captivating and challenging, every single day.
Mm. Terrific answer. The reason I wanted to ask is just because we have this impression of India and many other countries as well, but we're using India as an example, as being there's an Indian guy. They like cricket and they like hot food. And, the truth of the matter is like, it's way more complex than that. I'm going to interview a guy soon called Karashant Prashant. And he wrote a book called Cricket Country, which almost explains how nothing else in their entire ethnic history, including the English, could unify India. No one wanted to be an Indian. They all had their own individual ethnic identities. except cricket. And that's gone on to be obviously what it is. You would have seen while you were there, I'm sure, in the States or Canada, you never gave a shit about cricket, but you go there, you have to give a crap. I wonder about Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. I don't hear the same spiritual language and anecdotes coming out of these countries, although they are so close by ethnically. I know we just said that they're very different ethnically, but I mean, compared to China or across the border in the Himalayas, there's more. Is there a spiritual aspect to these countries as well that you know of, or is it really all centered in India?
I mean, absolutely. There's, enormous spiritual elements in Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, and some, hugely significant pilgrimage destinations in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. And so, absolutely that exists as this current of everyday life in all of these countries. But I think India, because of its history, it was the place, wasn't called India then, but it was the place where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. It was the place where Mahavira, this Jain Buddha-like figure for the Jain religion, had a very similar path and a very similar story. It is the country that produced, gurus and yogis in spades who not only had their temples in India, but also traveled around the world and spread these notions to people in the United States or in Australia or in Europe or in Canada. And so I think there is something slightly different with India, just purely based on its history and the people who have gone there for those specific reasons. And in a way, it's kind of compounded. It had those kind of original foundational stories, but a lot of the Westerners who traveled there through the 20th century, particularly around the middle of the 20th century, played a role in building this place up, building this country up specifically more than any other as this destination. And, you saw that in the 60s with the hippie trail, this, legendary thoroughfare that went from, essentially Turkey, from Europe, overland through the Middle East, with the ultimate destination being India and Nepal in some cases.
What an epic time to be traveling.
Incredible. I mean, an incredible journey to even think about right now, going overland through the Middle East and into India. And then we had this wave of people who heard those stories and flew there. So people, like Steve Jobs, I kind of mention him in a couple paragraphs in the book as being one of these big figures who had an incredibly formative experience in India that led him onto the path that he ultimately lived. And it was people like him and the Beatles who went there in '68 and up in Rishikesh and had their guru who they followed there and wrote, songs that ultimately ended up being the White Album, in these incredible meditation pods up in the hills.
Tyler Cohen's
all of these figures helped kind of exaggerate, helped build up this notion that India is the destination for those types of people. And so in some way it is rooted in India's history as being this place that, everybody wanted to go, this place of not only incredible, riches and spices and jewels and all those kind of tangible things, but something much more intangible, that, was in the minds of the British East India Company people who went there, was in the minds of, the Mughals when they came and took over, was this place that, has a lot that you can take, but has a lot to give you, that is intangible. And, so I think it's in part rooted in that history, but also in part rooted in the influence that travelers had on that country, in the minds of people who followed. And so in some ways, I do think that sets India apart.
What is it about gurus? Were you ever seduced by them when you were in India? You mentioned that you had quite a profound spiritual experience. For me, the temptation of them, it goes over my head. I just don't know what it is.
I think I can understand the temptation of a teacher, a guide, a father or mother figure for somebody who in their life may have had an absence of those types of things.
Projection of the father figure is famously susceptible to young men. That's the popularity of Jordan Peterson right there,
Right.
But still, yeah.
Different conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And but those types of things, I do understand that desire to find somebody who has a knowledge that I do not have, or has a way of seeing the world that I do not possess, and to sit at their feet and have a conversation about those things, and to may not have an enlightening, clouds parting moment, but may come away with it looking at the world a bit different. And so in those ways, I can totally understand people who go there and meet somebody who not only has a knowledge or a perspective, but who also has a devotion that I think a lot of people lack or don't have, which is often, and particularly when we're talking about, an Indian Sadhu, for example, these Hindu holy men, have this dedication to what they believe in that I think, at least, and I don't want to generalize too much, but at least in kind of my fragmented and disassociated life, being pulled in all these different directions, somebody who has given up everything and set foot onto one path with the ultimate goal of achieving enlightenment or achieving moksha, is an incredible, admirable, and in some ways enviable kind of devotion, singular devotion to life. And I think there's people
it's a very romantic ideal, for sure.
Absolutely. And I think there's people who see that and get sucked into that and want that. And so even though I never really had a moment where I felt like I was being pulled into something, into a relationship I didn't want, or into an experience I felt might be dangerous, or physically or even just sort of emotionally, I get the lure of them. I get the willingness to travel around the world and trek to a mountaintop to meet somebody who can tell you which way to walk on. And to me, that's something that and I had moments in India, to be honest, where I met people who I felt they had this incredibly compelling energy and this incredibly, and particularly as someone, who was either wanting to get into journalism or was in journalism, I just wanted to sit and ask questions. I just wanted to hear their story and to hear what path brought them to that point, and just sort of this deep fascination with people's lives and their stories. I think that was kind of how I got sucked into certain experiences, but the overall draw, I do understand. I do get that.
I'm happy you brought up Sadhus, because I think if you can introduce me and the audience to Sadhus, Hippie Hill, and then a little bit more on the Parvati Valley, then we'll rejoin Justin.
Sure.
In that part of the story.
Right. So Sadhus are these Hindu holy men, sadhvis if female, who have entered onto this very austere ascetic path where they've often given up their previous lives, they've renounced their belongings, and they essentially embark on a long journey. Some of them are quite sedentary, so they find their place and they stay within a town or a village or a temple. And often you find them walking across the country or, taking a train or whatever. But in in movement, traveling to ultimately find this pinnacle. It's their entire lives are sort of devoted to achieving moksha, the high state of enlightenment. And so they often, again, to kind of generalize, because there's all sorts of different kind of factions that they can belong to, different sects that they belong to, and they look quite different. But often, you'll see them not wearing a lot of clothing, with matted hair, like dreadlocks. And, for those that idolize Shiva, there's sort of, which is the 1/3 of the Hindu triumvirate, one of the most important gods in the Hindu pantheon, who is this kind of classic master of meditation and yoga, friend of animals, the great transformer of the world. They sort of dress in his image and walk in his shoes, and so they've also become these faces of spiritual India. So you'll see them on the cover of National Geographic magazine, and encountering them now in India is a very different experience than 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, because some of them have seen that their image has now been presented and sold to the world, and they want something out for that experience. They want something for that interaction with a tourist. And so often you will pay to receive a blessing, or you'll pay to be in their experience, or even to take their photograph. And so it's created this really interesting relationship between these highly spiritual people that tourists want to go and have an experience with, but also they want that experience to be pure and honest, and not one where they're paying for that experience or paying for the photograph. So it creates this kind of tension between these two groups of people. And Hippie Hill was this really incredible destination in the 60s and 70s that attracted a lot of foreigners to kind of create this counterculture outpost in the Himalayas. And so it attracted, musicians and free thinkers and artists to, live in caves and live in temples, to create this really fascinating cluster of spiritual seekers in the mountains through those years. And there were a number around the country during the hippie trail years, but Hippie Hill, also known as Cranks Ridge, was one that was really popular, but places like the Parvati Valley were, which is kind of not far from Rishikesh, but a bit kind of further north up the curve of the Himalayas.
And also for the listener, it's kind of right tucked up in that chimney-ish corner of India, right? If you look on a map without borders, you'd think they're in China or something like that.
It's
way up.
It's heading in that direction. It's up north. It takes about a full day by bus from Delhi to kind of get to the beginnings of the valley, and it was a place that was known in the hippie trail years in the 60s and 70s and 80s, largely because it produced some of the best hash on the subcontinent. And so it attracted, drug tourists there for a long, long time. But it also was this deeply had, these incredibly deep roots in Hinduism, where a place where Shiva is said to have meditated for 3,000 years. He named the valley after his wife, Parvati. So the valley's named after his wife. The river that runs through its heart is named after his wife. Incredibly important place among all of these little valleys that slice into the Himalayas, that slice into the mountains. And so it attracted, people who were looking for an escape, looking for, obviously, people who were, curious about hash, but also people who really wanted an isolated mountain experience, a place that for a long time has been free of influence from the Indian government, free of regulation, people who don't want to register online when they check into a guest house, people who want to kind of step away from the world for a little bit. There are places where there's zero cell reception, and Wi-Fi is only a very, very recent thing, and people are drawn to it for those reasons, to get away from the cosmopolitan India, the crowds and those aspects, and to find something that is, there's a word in Hindi called shanti, which is just peace and tranquility. And I think, a place like that really embodies that. It's quiet, it's relaxing, by comparison. And it gives you a moment to stare at the mountains and to sit in a temple or in these holy hot springs and to think about life, and to meet other, similarly minded people. So it's got these really interesting contrasts, this one place. And it's, out of all the places I've traveled to around the world, it is one of the most beautiful I've ever seen.
Mate, it looks unbelievable. I had to stop reading and look up on Google Maps this place, and then I just thought, what an idealized romantic sort of place to go, spiritual or not, hash or not. It just looks like just a remarkable place to go. And I encourage anyone listening to also Google it and have a look, because it doesn't look like Bombay, it doesn't look like Mumbai, it doesn't look like Rajasthan. As you say, it could be a whole nother country entirely. I think one point before we return to Justin is to underline the point on the Sadhus, that they, whilst traditionally might be authentic, ascetic people seeking enlightenment, because there has been a trade come around it, incentives sort of rule the world. So there's a market now to be a sadhu, almost. It's very, very vulnerable to frauds. So could you just double down on that point, how now some sadhus will ask for money just to be with them? It doesn't feel very authentic.
No, and that's something that I think a lot of people who are going to this part of the world, hoping to meet a guru or to meet a sadhu and to have that kind of relationship or that kind of experience, want it to be truthful and authentic and true, and honest. And, when you meet somebody and you feel like you have a genuine connection with them and the interaction is going great, and then they're saying, well, give me money for this, it doesn't feel as genuine. And, and I don't fault these people by any means for wanting, because for, years and decades, people were coming and taking from them, whether it was an experience or, as I said, in a photograph, taking from them and not necessarily giving much in return. And so I don't fault them for wanting to say, like, give me 100 rupees for that photograph because I'm posing for you or whatever. But it creates this tension, between that relationship of, the teacher and the student, that can be fraught and can end up quite complicated, and in some ways kind of treacherous. And so a lot of some of these sadhus who may not be on a genuine spiritual path, have kind of been given the nickname of business Baba. And Baba is this kind of honorific, meaning father. But a business Baba, somebody who isn't on a genuine spiritual path, but is somebody who realizes that the image and the costume and what they can offer to tourists is worth something. And so, ultimately, when I look back at all of the different sadhus and holy people I met, there were absolutely some who saw me as a paying customer rather than somebody passing by and who they wanted to talk to. And so it inevitably creates these problematic situations where the student, the traveler, wants something out of this experience, is often quite desperate in that desire, and the teacher is totally willing to give that as long as the student pays for it. And that can create this quite treacherous, quite dangerous, at an extreme, but also just like very uncomfortable and problematic relationship that, you know, at times has led to confrontation and has led to, you know, argument and worse. And it's something that I think a lot of people maybe keep in mind, or maybe should keep in mind about those experiences, or at least have that kind of question in their mind, about how much of this desire is coming from me, is rooted in who I am here, and how much of this disappointment in what the relationship ends up being has fully stemmed from you know, my kind of you know, European or North American perspective on what India is, what the Sadhu is, what they offer to me. And I think that's a kind of awareness that I think, you know, I think potentially more people might should have about these interactions.
So Justin has just trailblazed the most remarkable journey up until this point. You know, amazing times in the Philippines, where he sort of went off the grid for a while there as well. Beautiful photos of this epic road trip throughout the States, but then also throughout India. And he ends up at the Parvati Valley. I'm sorry, I'm butchering that pronunciation. Parvati. What is it again?
I've heard a few different ones, but the one that I've heard most often is Parvati. A bit more emphasis on the par. Yeah.
So he's in Parvati Valley. He's spent... it's contentious to say how much time, but up to 3 weeks living in a cave. True vagabond stuff. He was such an outdoorsman, you know, like a very romanticized traveler, the type of person that would be in a fictional movie as the character, as the traveler, as the idealized romantic traveler. And he's on this almost desperate sense for finding some sort of spiritual conclusion or answer. And that brings us to what is the end of the story, because it's Justin's whole relationship with this Sadhu which doesn't make any sense at all, because Justin is clearly a smart, really self-sustaining guy, and you would expect him to be able to spot a fraud right away. Yet while everyone else saw a fraud in Rawat, this Sadhu, Justin apparently did not. And despite Justin insisting to the world that it was in fact an authentic relationship, as we've just spoken about, it turns out that he was paying the guy, which is just so unauthentic. And you would expect someone like Justin, who was really after the truth and the deep meaning, would reject the payment. And he's the type of guy, charismatic enough, he would be able to seek out a very genuine Sadhu. But then to double down on that, this Sadhu claimed to have, you know, chopped his penis off just to curtail his lust. A very romantic idea of, wow, look how ascetic this man is. Look how spiritual he is. And that's something that should be easily falsifiable, since a Sadhu is largely naked most of the time. This Sadhu had growths on his elbows and his shoulders, which he claimed was from his excessive yoga, which, again, to a guy as smart as Justin, should be easily falsifiable, because it just doesn't happen. And it's like, well, prove how good you are at yoga then. You know what I mean? So all of this stuff basically culminates, and it's easy for us to look back in hindsight and say how obvious it all was. But how do you explain this relationship between Justin and the Sadhu when Justin was such a smart, perceptible guy? Was he being taken for a ride, or was he sort of like a willing participant?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And, you know, ultimately, it's one of the questions that I explore in the book. And so, you know, Justin arrives in the Parvati Valley, and he very quickly heads up to one of its most extreme points, you know, cut off from cell service. And he, this holy place where Shiva had meditated, there's these beautiful hot springs, and finds a forest and finds this cave and lives in it for about 3 weeks with essentially nothing. And while he's there, he meets this Sadhu who is living near the hot springs and becomes very enamored with him. And we know all this because Justin ultimately descended from this place called Kirganga, this location, and posted about it online. So he shared this interaction. He talked about who he had met, the impact that this man had on him, and shared videos and photographs and all this information about what had happened during those 3 weeks. And I think in some ways it's quite telling, what he shared and what he left out, and to kind of hopefully kind of answer your question about why did he not only become so enamored with this man and spend 3 weeks with him, and I mean kind of every day visiting him for hours on end, helping clean the hut that he was living in, a very kind of subservient relationship. And in the stuff that Justin wrote about, he very clearly wanted something big out of this relationship. Not only that, but also when Justin returns down to cell service, he's restocking for this final journey that the Sadhu has invited him on, to trek for days to this holy lake at the source of the Parvati River, the glaciers at the top of the valley, where they were going to spend weeks meditating and visiting this holy site. And so he was not only so attracted to this person to spend weeks with him in his hut, but also to follow him on this journey for many more weeks, this pilgrimage. And I think in some ways, we've spoken a little bit about the lure of India and of the gurus and the sadhus. And I think in some ways, Justin, as smart as he was, as competent as he was in survival settings, and even on the road, he was a very competent, experienced traveler who'd been in a lot of different countries and a lot of different travel experiences and situations. At times, that lure of that experience becomes so strong that it's hard to avoid, and it's easy to lose that rational, questioning part of yourself completely. And I think I may not have followed a sadhu on my own into the mountains for weeks, but there were moments in India when I was first there in my early 20s where I did things that I knew I was being drawn by the power of the experience. And when I first came across Justin's story and knew that he had disappeared on this fateful trek that he embarked on with the sadhu to this holy lake, to the source of this holy river, I immediately flashed back to an experience I had at the end of my first year in India, where I trekked to the source of the Ganges River, India's holiest river. And completely on my own, for a couple days heading up there, you go to the glacier that drips down, the purest water in that country, the source of that river that feeds so many millions. And I thought about the steps that I took and the steps that Justin took on two very similar pilgrimages, two very similar, treks, and the pitfalls, the things that I was drawn to. I was drawn to this incredible experience. I had been to the Sundarbans, where the Ganges spills out into the Bay of Bengal. I'd been to Varanasi. I'd been to Haridwar, all these holy sites along the Ganges River. And so in some ways it felt fitting to complete that circle and to go to the source of the river. I think in some ways I understand why Justin got a bit succumbed by and a bit enamored by the lure of that story and the lure of that experience, as somebody who had struggled with father figures in his life and was desperate for a teacher and desperate for somebody who was going to show him his way forward. All of that, and when you read the book and you put together all of these pieces and you look at that final question of him saying, yes, I'm going to go with you on this journey, it all kind of makes sense. The person who he went with, the location where he was, what he hoped to achieve, all of his history in some ways was building to this one decision, this one final journey. And I find it quite understandable when you look at it in totality of all of the different forces at play, why he was so drawn to this experience and so drawn to this person in such a deep, powerful way. He had tried all of these different jobs, all of these different countries, all of these different experiences. And ultimately, and I think when you do those things, the pressure builds. The pressure for that final moment where you're sitting on a mountaintop and the clouds part and you're with your guide and he's talking about the universe. That pressure is enormous.
and you've had so many experiences again and again. The next one will be it. The next one will be it. The next one will be it. Yeah, that's totally true.
And
the
here
pressure
you are,
cooker. Yeah.
and here you are, in India, in the Himalayas, meeting a sadhu who's invited you on a pilgrimage to, the glacial source of this holy river. I mean, the temptation for a lot of people, and particularly for someone like Justin, would be enormous. And I think in those moments where we have the pressure of experience, often our filters, our second guessing, our questioning, our kind of truth detector starts to fall away, and we start to put ourselves into situations that potentially might be a little bit more dangerous, or with people who may not be fully honest. And I've had a lot of moments like that, and I'm sure a lot of people have as well. Somebody who is promising something big or small, and away we go, and before we know it, we're feeling uncomfortable.
Totally.
And
yeah.
when you layer on Justin's history with social media, it becomes this other pressure pushing at his back. The grand experience to post about, his audience who is captivated and watching and waiting for the next post, the next big experience. And he had teased this one to his followers, that he was going for 3 weeks with this sadhu, and all of this fascinating history, as you mentioned, some of the sadhu's kind of quirks. And, this was going to be an experience that his audience was going to eat up. And that's another pressure at your back when you've promised something big to your audience and to yourself, and you don't want to let both of those things down. And so when you think about it in Justin's entire history and all of the forces at play in his life, but also in the location, the people who he met, everything at that moment was in some ways, you're right, a bit of a pressure cooker, an enormous wave at his back, pushing him higher and higher into the valley, closer and closer to those mountains, and ultimately may have been one of the, or perhaps the largest factor to ultimately led to his disappearance.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he just spent several weeks in a cave. He had such a high bar that he had to keep topping. But I think that was just brilliantly said. I didn't pick up on that fully as I was reading it, but as you package it in that broader explanation there, I can completely see it now, for sure. Quite simply, it was just the blinders were on. The other people who would have seen this sadhu didn't have the same context that Justin was operating under. So it was more willing to say, fuck it. It might look sketchy, but hey, I trust the guy. Because that was another thing that you really emphasized. Justin, at the core of his traveling philosophy, which I think is just brilliant. It should be, but it is just endless trust. There's few things make you as happy as putting your faith into someone else and then having that faith realized. And so, yeah, it really makes sense.
And you're absolutely right. And it was this thread, in some ways, quite a dark thread throughout the book and throughout Justin's life, of trust and placing trust into people in this very honest and genuine and respectable. Like I deeply admire it in him, in this way, but also, this really quite tragic history of being burned by that trust. And there were moments, not to give anything away, but there were moments in his childhood and his young life that of trusting people that ended up in really, really terrible situations, mainly when he was a teenager. But also putting his faith and his trust into some of these father figures, some of these leaders, some of these guides who he deeply wanted to trust and ultimately didn't end up who he wanted them to be. He had classic moments on the road of trusting the wrong person and being robbed, or being, in a fight, and or being lost and scared, of moments where he, and I think in some ways, you might say, well, why wasn't he learning from these experiences? Why wasn't his like, trust, that kind of deep, in some ways naive, but I think really beautiful trust in people, seeing the good in people. Why didn't that get tarnished? Why didn't he hold that for only the people that he really knew very, very well? And I think ultimately it says a lot about Justin's character as somebody who was constantly trying to see the light in the world and in people. He constantly was trying to look at them in a positive way and to see the beauty that they can give to the world and the beauty that they can give to him. And I think that's something that, I've essentially been following this story for 5 years, and it was something that I really feel like I'm hopefully kind of taking away from that, is this really admirable quality of seeing people for the good in them, not purely for everybody's complicated histories or whatever. But, that kind of trust has its limitations. And in this story has very tragic conclusion. Trusting the wrong person, trusting the wrong experience, and ultimately that leading him astray or into a very dangerous situation. But ultimately it's hard to criticize when it is rooted in something really profoundly beautiful.
Yeah, it as you're speaking there, it kind of reminds me of my brother, just like this naive level of trust and faith in another person with zero precedence. Just a random person you meet, like, hey, can I borrow your wallet? I gotta go run and do something. It's like, yeah, of course, man, here you go. That's an amazing quality in a person, amazing quality. And it sounds like Justin really had this as well. But yeah,
and particularly,
you got to keep your wits about you, don't you? It's great,
Absolutely, but in particularly for people who are traveling and for people who are, far from home and potentially on their own, and whatever country they're in, I think there is an inclination to be very skeptical of everybody you meet, and to think that everybody who is coming up to talk to you or every interaction you have is a dangerous one. And of course there are dangers on the road, and in people and in places, and you absolutely have to keep your wits about you. But I think there's this inclination. It's almost like there's the first time you meet somebody, you're very skeptical, and I think Justin was not that person. He was somebody who was very curious and very interested in people. And if that skepticism arose, so be it. But he wasn't going into an interaction with skepticism. And to me, that's something that absolutely it can lead you astray. And absolutely it can lead you into tough situations. But it's such an admirable quality to have in somebody, to not immediately be concerned that they are going to do you wrong. And I really have taken that away from spending a good chunk of my life, following in this person's footsteps.
Mm. So take us back to the story. Justin has embarked on this trip to the source of the Parvati river to meditate for several weeks or an undetermined amount of time with this sadhu. The sadhu returns and Justin is never seen again. So what happened to you?
Well, I don't want to give too much away, because I hope that people can pick up the book and explore that aspect of the story. But in very kind of general terms, the sadhu returns to his hut in Kirganga, and life kind of goes back to normal in the Parvati Valley. And Justin had this date that he had put on social media as kind of mid to late September. He had embarked in late August, and so it was a little bit vague of when he was going to reappear. But ultimately the days went by, and then the weeks went by, and then people who knew him well, close friends back in the U.S., and some people who were travelers who he had met in the Parvati Valley, became very concerned about where he went, because as somebody who lived, very deeply online, when he would have reappeared, he would have made contact, he would have posted something in some form. And so what happened is that this search began, this very complicated international search, part on the ground in India. His mom and one of his friends flew to India to launch this incredible search for any traces or any clues, or ultimately going into it was to bring Justin home, with this deep belief that he was still okay. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he found another cave that he had been living in. But what happened when they arrived was the story got a lot more complicated. And, the Sadhu, when he was interrogated, his story kept shifting, and that raised a whole bunch of other questions. And the story just becomes a lot more complicated on the ground and back home in the US, of all of these different people who were concerned about his well-being, but also people who felt they knew him very, very well. And so you had people theorizing about what had happened. And a lot of people believed that Justin was still out there, that he was going on an experience for a reason, and to leave him be until he comes back. And some of those people were fed by this quite famous final line that Justin posted to his blog and to his social media accounts before he embarked on this trip, which is, outlining this journey, this pilgrimage. And at the very end says, "If I don't come back, don't look for me." And a lot of people hung on to that line as being absolutely the truth, that he was
Chilling
going on
final
something.
Words.
Absolutely. And in some ways, I think it might have delayed a bit of a search. I think it might have, was a factor to, the concern, the level of concern. Justin's competency in the wild was also something that I think, eased a lot of people's initial fears, was that, if anybody could come out of a tough survival situation, it was Justin.
Literally anybody. He was in the top end tail and distribution of wildlife people in the whole world.
Yeah. And so it the story gets much more complicated then, and I hope people pick up the book and
absolutely
follow it from then
great
on. And
leave it on the cliffhanger there. Don't say any more, because there is the fate of the Sadhu. There is your own experience going there, doing your own investigation, and then there is, of course, your speculation as to what happened. Yeah, it's a terrific book. I mean, we covered the India part, but for sure, everyone should go out and read it or listen to it.
Yeah, the audiobook. Yeah, I recorded the audiobook myself. But the one thing we haven't touched on was the other kind of dark side of the valley itself. This really tragic side of the Parvati Valley, which, despite the mountains and the temples and the hot springs and the hash and all of these kind of, magnets that draw people in, over the past couple decades leading up to Justin's disappearance, dozens of other international backpackers had mysteriously vanished in the valley, in this one tiny little spot. And it, the title of the book, the valley was given these nicknames: the Valley of Shadows, the Valley of Death, and India's backpacker Bermuda Triangle, of people who had gone there. Essentially one person a year just completely vanished off the face of the earth, and with very, very few clues, and often a family going there to search for their loved one that often left with more questions than when they began. And so Justin, when I came across this story, I had heard about the Parvati Valley. I knew about its dark history. And so in part, it was this incredible life and then this incredible person and all the forces that led up to his disappearance. But it was also this location that was absolutely fascinating and very tragic, of all of these people who've gone missing there and all of the families who have embarked on a similar search to his own, to try to make sense of what happened to their son or their daughter. And, the valley itself became this other character of the story, this other force that is obviously quite powerful, and this very kind of dark shadow that haunts, I think, the story and haunts Justin's disappearance. And that added all sorts of other complications to the search for him, as sort of the latest person to disappear in this long, dark, and very tragic line of vanishings.
Yeah, and what adds further complexity to that as well is the fact that it is such a flourishing drug trade in the area, right? And so the people that disappear, you don't know if they want to disappear because it attracts people that are just happy to exit their previous life and start the new one. And there's plenty of examples of sort of Westerners who wound up years later, just living the ascetic life. And so you don't know if they were from there, whether they got sucked into the drug trade, removed by the drug trade, or just fell into the river because they had an accident, and all the myriad problems that could happen. So it makes it just a terrible place to have a crime investigation, which obviously becomes the case here as well.
Yeah, and for me to go there, and to do my own kind of investigation into what happened, I went there twice. The first time about 5 months or 6 months after Justin disappeared, and then again for about a month to work specifically on the book. And there were a lot of theories about what happened, not only to Justin but to all these other different people who've disappeared, and becoming caught up in the drug trade, unwittingly or absolutely willingly, was definitely a possible factor for some of these people. Accidents, of course, this is a remote mountainous landscape with some very dangerous features, and so simple accidents were absolutely possible. And because it is so remote, most of these people who disappeared, their bodies were never found. So there, but as you mentioned, there's this other, I think, really complicated and fascinating aspect to people who go to India specifically, and to some of these more remote Himalayan regions, which is this intentional, the if I don't come back, don't look for me kind of motivation of willingly wanting to disappear, of giving up your belongings, of stepping into a new life. And there are just dozens and dozens of examples of this. A couple that I include in the book of people who showed up at their embassy 15 years later without a passport, saying, I'm so-and-so from such country, I want to go home. Or the fellow who I met at the tail end of my first trip in India, who was living in a cave outside of Rishikesh, and was originally from Sweden, and had arrived in India 7 years before, had become completely fascinated by Hinduism, converted, and had burnt his passport and had no intention of ever returning home. And I met, honestly, dozens of people like that at various stages of that kind of renunciation and that kind of transformation over the years in India, to the point where they, are their own kind of subculture in that country. Of people who become so fascinated by it that they are willing to, in some cases, cut away from their family and friends and start a new life. In some cases, a bit more of a balanced approach, who just want to live in India, full time. But there's a lot of people who did the full break. And so it became this other question. And some of the people who went missing there, there were these questions and anecdotes that they were seen in other parts of India. And, of course, they were probably just another traveler who looked a bit similar. But it added to this question of, when you looked at Justin's story, in particular with his final line, was that a joke or was he serious? It added this question of, well, maybe he still is out there traveling. Maybe he still is out there wandering. Maybe he did find his moment. Maybe he had that ultimate parting of the clouds in the mountains and is still out there on his path. And in some ways it sort of ends on this kind of hopeful note of that maybe he did find what he was ultimately looking for.
Yeah. That reminds me of something that I failed to bring up earlier in the sort of spiritual discussion of India, and that's this notion of India syndrome. You just recounted a lot of very dramatic changes in personality and worldviews upon entering India. Could you just give us the skinny on that? Because I think that was a fascinating part of the book as well. You don't hear of a Swedish syndrome, for example. Or maybe you do, but it's
there's a few kind of cousins, versions of this around the world, Florence syndrome and Jerusalem syndrome. But India, it's kind of started, at least in name, with this French psychiatrist who was posted to Bombay, then Bombay in the mid-'80s, to work at the French embassy, which was kind of unusual to have a psychiatrist posted to an embassy abroad. But part of his job was to kind of hold the passports and the travel documents for travelers if they wished at the embassy, and then they would go travel around for 3 months or 6 months and then come back, pick up their plane ticket and their passport, and then fly back home. And so he would see travelers arriving, and then he would see them at the end of their travel, at the end of their experience, at the end of their trip. And what he began noticing in some of them were these quite significant, and in some cases quite severe, personal and personality changes. And he documented it in this really fascinating book, and this condition that ultimately became known as India syndrome, which is not a clinical diagnosis necessarily, but more of a spectrum of behavioral changes that people who go to India experience. And so I interviewed him, the author, but also a couple Indian psychiatrists who treat these foreigners. And one of them, who has this practice in Delhi, sees about one foreign traveler every single week in his office who's coming in under some influence of India syndrome. And on the benign end, it can often be kind of extreme culture shock, where people, become very isolated, become very disoriented, depressed. But on the extreme end, it's people who have become so enamored by what India has to offer, in large part influenced by drugs, but also spiritual elements, that they have these kind of breakdowns there. And in some cases, there's extreme psychosis. There's some really, really serious clinical side effects of this. And so these psychiatrists have seen time and time again these cases of people who, the police have been called because a man has, burnt his passport, given away his belongings, has covered his body in ash, and is walking around like a sadhu. Or, there was this case of this American woman who was in an ashram in Rishikesh who believed that she had become an apsara, a Hindu kind of mythological temptress who would tempt the priests of their resolve.
That one was a bit too yuck for me, because it's more than a temptress, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, and so what happens in some of these extreme cases is people, think they are a god reincarnate, or they think they are, a being that has been brought back to life, or they think they have become a sadhu, or have just found a path and have devoted everything to them. And so these psychiatrists get calls from the police, they get calls from embassies, they get calls from concerned family members to go and try to find their loved ones. And in some cases, it ends up with people who have had these very serious breaks with their previous lives and ended up in a cave or in an ashram and have never returned home. And, I've seen it in friends of mine. I saw it in a lot of people who I met in my couple of years in India, who were absolutely on some point in that spectrum, being so deeply influenced by what India has to offer. And I think the psychiatrist broke it down really in a really interesting way to me, that he kind of looks at these people in two groups. That there's one that comes with this really deep desire to have a spiritual experience there and will at all costs have that experience, and so pushes themselves into increasingly greater extremes in that quest, in that search. And that may mean, trying hash in an ashram with a sadhu who you don't trust, or giving up your belongings, or changing your perspective on the world, or what have you. And the second group is of people who come to India with this kind of deep-rooted trauma or personal experience that they kind of either hope to resolve there or don't, or it hasn't quite been resolved. And because of the pressures of that country, can bring that to the surface and bring those types of emotions and those histories to the surface in often a very kind of traumatic, and challenging way. And so it became this really, really interesting force to apply some of these stories to. And, I don't really say in the book in any outright way that Justin was experiencing this, because I'm not a psychiatrist, I can't do that. But I think if you look at some of his background and some of his history, I think it's hard to not see how he was being influenced by this country in a very, very profound way before he arrived there and when he was there. So it added this really kind of fascinating aspect to not only his story, but I think to the larger story of what draws people to that country, and what happens when they arrive.
Yeah, it does sort of compound on this inexplicable draw of India, doesn't it? Because all countries have their unique charms. You'll have the best time of your life if you go to Russia or if you go to Mexico, and you can have great local experiences. But apparently it is India that could draw a psychosis out of you. That's it's amazing. I can't think it. You could go to China, you can go to Australia. I mean, I don't know much about Africa, but I'm assuming, if you went and hung out with a tribe in Namibia for a while, it'd be an amazing experience, but would it fundamentally change your worldview completely? There's kind of nothing like it, eh?
We can always have transformative experiences in any country with any person or any people. And they can be enormous. Like, I've had experiences all around the world. I've had experiences, in Canada, in places that I've visited, that
but it's like
had a huge impact upon me. But, but to have, I don't think there's ever been a moment where I've been as close to, and I haven't actually been that close to it, but to stepping away from my family and, who I was and where I was going and wanting to live in India for the rest of my life. That has only really ever happened in one country. And it's when I was feeling that in that first trip, I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know what that was necessarily at that time, in 2008. But it was ultimately, that's what I was feeling. And I think it is a unique place in that regard, where people are can be so caught up in what India has to offer spiritually, which is different than anywhere else. We've talked about a lot about this. That can lead you onto a path that ultimately could end up at a place where you are no longer talking with your family, you're no longer talking with your friends, and you're living in a cave or in a temple, or changing your religion, and giving up your belongings and everything. And it may sound kind of bizarre, but there are so many cases of this. This is not an isolated thing or a few examples. It is a very, very, very common occurrence in this part of the world.
I feel like I would be quite susceptible to it, to be honest. I'm going to go to India soon, but I need to keep my fucking wits about me so I don't become entranced by some charismatic father figure.
First time to India?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there are it's an incredible country, and I can't wait to go back. I can't wait to go back to the Parvati Valley. It's a place that I find doesn't really leave you. When I came home, I on every trip that I've been to India, when I've come home from those trips, I've, more so than any other country that I've been to, has stuck with me in a really kind of, really kind of deep level. And I still think about it all the time. And so I'm sure you'll be fine. I'm sure you'll enjoy it, but I'm sure it'll be hard at times too, because it is a country that can push and pull you in fairly dramatic ways.
I think that is a pretty natural conclusion to the theme of the podcast, right? But there are a few more questions I'd love to ask you that are more general interest that I try to ask as many guests as possible. But do you think there's anything left on the table there? I mean, we don't want to give it all away. You need the cliffhanger to get the book.
Yeah, I think that's great. Yeah.
All right. Then tell me what it was like sharing this story with both Rolf Potts and Chris Ryan. People I've listened to loads. I imagine you did as well beforehand. They're very influential guys in this sort of travel niche, especially in podcasting. What was it like speaking with them and sharing this story of their friend?
Speaking with Chris Ryan, when he interviewed me for his podcast was the second time we spoke, because I interviewed him for the book, because Justin had come across Chris and had become quite a big fan of his podcast and his books, and Chris had invited him on the podcast, and so Justin had been interviewed on Chris's podcast, Tangentially Speaking, twice. And they had become quite, close friends. And on Justin's last trip, Justin spent quite a lot of time with Chris in Thailand. They connected, they crossed paths. And so to speak with him, to be interviewed him for his podcast was a really interesting experience and different than any other that I've had, because Chris knew him personally and had his own feelings about Justin as a person, as a traveler, and about what happened. And it added this really, obviously very personal, very intimate element to the interview, which I really appreciated. And so that was really a really interesting one to be a part of, because a lot of people kind of look at Justin as a character in a story, or maybe they followed him on social media, or they just read the book and are interested in the book. But Chris was shattered when Justin disappeared. And, so there was this emotional element to that conversation I thought was really interesting, and to his perspective. And Rolf Potts was a wonderful experience to be on his podcast, because I was a huge fan of his book, Vagabonding, for many years, and had a big influence on me as when I was traveling. And so to be on his podcast, honestly, was an honor. And I think it was quite a fitting interview as well, because Justin loved Rolf's book, Vagabonding, and carried it around like a Bible, and kind of applied a lot of the parts of it to his life. And was one of the last people that Justin messaged before he went on this fateful trip, to say how much he idolized Rolf and to thank him for writing the book, and which was such an interesting aspect to what happened in Justin's final days, of the final messages that he sent out to family and friends and some of his idols, which, there's a way to read that I think is very interesting, about somebody who either knew something might happen, had a bit of a premonition, or knew this was going to be a moment where he wanted to say his final thanks to people. And so that was a really interesting aspect to talking with Rolf about that. But personally, as a writer, it was just an honor to be interviewed by him.
Yeah. Nice. Well, that brings me to the final three. the ones I like to leave as many guests as possible. What is a moment that you experienced, and then looking back in your life, you just can't believe you were a part of it? And let me know if you want more context.
Sure. A part of it in a positive way, or
whatever way it comes to you. You just can't believe you were a part of that. How,
I mean, I think there's a recent one in the past month that I, as a young writer getting into journalism, doing my journalism degree, maybe hoping one day to write a book, never thought would ever happen to me. And, it may come across as, bragging or something, and I hope it doesn't, but not that long ago, the book was reviewed by the New York Times, and it appeared on the cover of the New York Times book review, which is just something that never happens. And I never, ever thought that was even a remote possibility, that that a book that I wrote might appear on the cover of the book review. So that was one of those moments, and I'm still kind of reeling from it, where I just never, ever expected that was even a remote possibility for my career. And I'm still kind of having a hard time believing that happened.
That's amazing, man. I remember reading I think it was on Twitter you wrote it, and you were sort of crying on the way home, and I thought what a fulfilling experience.
I went to this great little newspaper and magazine store near my house and picked up a copy, and outside was this like classic old magazine rack or newspaper rack that said the New York Times on it, and it was, I'll never forget that moment. With my little baby son strapped to my chest, walking home.
Beautiful moment, man. That's exactly the type of experience that I'm going for with that question. We've spoken quite a lot about India. You might have seen that this podcast is sort of largely geopolitical. Is there a country that you're very bullish on looking into the future? What is a country that you're most bullish on?
To kind of stay in the region, the first place that comes to mind is Nepal. And, it's a country that, is kind of sandwiched between these two superpowers, China and India, and yet has its own, distinct identity. And it's gone through some really tough times, even pre-pandemic, with, earthquakes and avalanches in the Everest region and all sorts of things that have really hammered the tourist industry, which is such a huge driver of the economy there. But it has sort of a spirit to it, and not to get too kind of woo-woo, but it has a spirit to it of recovery and of bounce back, and of kind of dig yourself out, that I've always really admired about that country, and I've loved the times I visited there. And I feel like at this kind of I know we're not post-pandemic, but I think at a time when people are starting to travel again and are wanting to, potentially visit, travel internationally, I could see that country being high on people's lists and experiencing quite a significant boom from the travel industry of people wanting to go and, trek in those regions. And it, for such a small country that is often kind of overshadowed by its neighbors, it has so much to offer in this tiny package, and some of the most wonderful people I've ever met on the road. And so I think economically, I think socially, I think it has a really, really bright future.
Amazing. The first Nepal we've had.
Yeah.
The Nepalese, they kind of run the restaurant scene in Sydney. Well, they don't run it, but they're the cooks.
Oh, yeah.
They're the beating heart of the restaurant scene. All the chefs that I ever worked with, or that I would just see through the sort of window into the kitchen, Nepalese. So amazing people, such nice, great sense of humor. Finally, Harley, this is my favorite question. If you could witness a conversation between any two people of history, so listen to a podcast, no language barrier, dead or alive, who are you listening to?
Wow. I feel like you should have sent me these questions beforehand, because I probably need to think about this one. God, that's a hard one. Two people. Okay, this might be a little bit different than, your classic kind of big figures in history sitting down, over tea or whatever. But my grandparents have a pretty remarkable, or had a pretty remarkable love story. And they met in, post World or pre World War II in Vancouver in Canada. And shortly thereafter, my grandfather shipped out and was part of the Canadian contingent as a tank commander going into Italy and fighting in Italy, and then the liberation of Holland, and spent 4 years away from my grandmother, who was his girlfriend at the time. And they wrote these love letters back and forth to each other. And he sent her about a letter a week, and I have them all because my grandma kept them all. And so they have this incredible love story. And the only letter that he kept, because he was fighting and in Europe, and some got lost and got ruined, was the letter in response to his proposal by mail to my grandmother. The yes letter was the only letter he kept and brought home from the war. And so I have this incredible window into their life through these letters. And this budding relationship across continents and oceans, in this terrible, terrible time, of my grandmother in Vancouver as a young woman, and my grandfather in Europe as a young man. But to get a window into their life early on, one of their first conversations, or that when they were ultimately reunited, when he took a ship from the UK and landed in Halifax and took a train across the country and arrived in Vancouver, to hear their conversation, after 4 years of being separated, of now being married, to them to sit down and to kind of talk about in person about what the two of them had gone through, would be a really, obviously that's a very intimate thing, but I think it would be a really wonderful thing to be a fly on the wall, and to know kind of how that story ended, and how that's in some ways how that story began.
Super beautiful. Great answer. And it's kind of funny. The first 70-ish recordings, no one mentioned family. And now the last 3 that I've done, people have mentioned their own family. So I wonder if that's just a crazy coincidence, or if that's some hangover from the pandemic. I don't know. But that's beautiful. What a great answer. I live over here in Sweden, right? But something I really, really want to do, if I can, before they pass away, is try and interview my grandparents, because I feel like I think we're from a similar generation, but so we know too little about our older generations, and my parents know nothing about their grandparents, and it's kind of like, what's going on, guys? Why are the stories not passed down? So where you come from. You have a lot of either understanding for why granddad's like that, or so that's beautiful. That would be an amazing thing.
It tells you who you are in some ways, and
gives you so much more context.
Looking back, and looking back can often lead you the way forward. And you're right. I mean, I had talked to my grandfather a little bit, but he was kind of part of that generation that didn't really talk about it, and I was fascinated by the stuff during World War II. But the one thing I did do was, when I read his letters, he was getting a bit older then, and his memory wasn't as good. But the one thing I did do was I transcribed some passages from his letters and printed them out, and then hit my recorder, and he just read them. And so I have these beautiful audio tapes of my grandfather reading some of these letters that he wrote to my grandmother on tape. But even just having those documents, I mean, they're beautiful. There's 225 of them, and an incredible kind of historical document as well. Yeah, I've thought about kind of the next book, and I would love to do that story in some capacity, maybe not next, but at some point, maybe later on, and kind of to go back and to follow, using his letters as a guide, but to follow his journey through Italy and through Europe. And, there's this crazy story that when he was in northern Italy and Italy fell, and he was going to be transferred to France and then Holland, they couldn't leave all their armaments, so he sunk his tank. He drove it into Lake Trasimeno, and he was a tank commander, won the Victoria Cross, and I would love to go find his tank.
Man, what a good day's work, liberating the Netherlands. Yeah. Not bad.
Yeah.
Not bad.
Yeah.
Anyway. Well, Harley, amazing book. Anyone who's interested in the story of Justin or to learn more about India, for sure, it's an absolute must-read. Thank you, mate. Very generous with your time and generous with your responses. Yeah, cheers.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a total pleasure.
Cheers, Harley. Thank you again, mate. And if any of that appealed to you, dear listener, then do go out and consume Harley's book, because if something in there, appealed to you, piqued your interest, believe me, the book goes into it much deeper. Harley researched first person here and extensively, and wrote an amazing book, really an amazing book, because it is more than just the life of Justin Alexander. It is as well this philosophy on the Parvati Valley, but as well as India as a spiritual destination. And it's just so, so fascinating. And it really piqued my interest in India, and was largely the catalyst for the episode that came out last week or 2 weeks ago with Prashant about India serving as cricket, serving as the defining characteristic of what it meant to be an Indian. The role of sport in creating culture, and also these days in spurring nationalism, and the role of sport, particularly cricket in India, of forming identity. It's fascinating. It's got nothing to do with this except for the common theme of India, but nonetheless, absolutely amazing book. I encourage you to consume it. Thank you again, Harley. You're an absolute legend. Now, dear listener, my ambition for the podcast is to corner the market for eclectic curiosities in whatever country it is you're listening in from. So if this is the first time you're hearing this appeal, I'm going to make it much more redacted than it might usually be in other podcast episodes. But for me to achieve this goal of cornering the market for eclectic curiosities, the podcast must be reviewed, and it must be distributed and then therefore shared and spread. The only way really that the algorithms or the lists generate according to reviews. So Apple, you can review with a comment. Spotify, you just review with stars. Wherever you're listening to, there is some sort of reviewing mechanism. In addition to telling people about this and sharing it on Twitter and everything, also leave nice, healthy reviews. So that's all from me. Thank you, you absolute legends. All the best. Until next time, cheers again, Harley. Bye-bye.